Today's daf is daf Tes Zayin, and we'll start on the top of the Amud, but let's just remind ourselves that at the very beginning of this parak on Tes Vav Amud Beis, on the list of Psule Avoda, meaning the Ovdim, that apostle, we find a Zar, a non-Kohen, and the Gemara wanted to know from whence do we derive that a Zar, if a non-Kohen goes ahead and does the avoda is completely invalid. And the Gemara on the bottom of Tesvavam and Beis had quoted a brisa of Rabbi Shmuel, who derives the conclusion that a zar pasels his avoda, is machal his avoda from a kal v'chomer. And what was the kal v'chomer? We know that a balmum, a Kohen who has a blemish, although he's allowed to eat from kodshim, even kodshe kodshim, but if he goes in and he does the avoda, it's mechuleles. And therefore, we could certainly derive a conclusion about zar here on the top of our Amud. Zar she'eno ochel, a zar can't eat under any circumstances the basar of kodshe kodshim, meaning let's say a chatos or an osham, is eno dimshim ovad chilel. In other words, the zar is more chamur than the balmum, because the balmum is allowed to eat from kodshe kodshim, whereas a zar cannot eat kodshe kodshim. So if a balmum is machal his avodah, then how much more so a zar should be machal avodah? The Gemara rejects this with a pircha. Mala balmum shkein osabo karev kemakriv. There's a special chumrah in the category of balmum in that it affects and disqualifies not only the Kohen ha'oved, but also the animal that should be brought on the mizbeach. If it's got a mum, it's completely disqualified. So the Torah is more machmir with regard to the category called balmum, and therefore you cannot derive any conclusions from balmum to the case of a zar. In the case of a zar, there's no such thing as karev kemakriv. I mean, there's no animal. We're talking about the fact that he's not a Kohen. An animal can never be a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Tame yochiach. Let's take the case of a Kohen who did the avoda b'tumah, and the avoda is mechulelis, it's completely invalid. And in the case of tumah, there's no such thing as tumah with regard to an animal. So this principle of karev kemakriv would not apply to a tame, because an animal is a balchai, and a balchai is not makabel tumah. And therefore, we see that the fact that there's karev kemakriv is not the gorem, it's not the cause of the chilul avoda. Gemara says he can't derive anything from tamei. Malu tamei shekem metame. Tuma is such that he passes on tuma to someone else. I mean, the fact that a person is a zar, a non-kohen, that doesn't in any way is not contagious, that would impact on someone else and make him into a zar. So the Gemara says, Balmum yochiach. Well, Balmum will fill in the plug that's missing in the case of a Tameh, because Balmum cannot pass on his blemish to someone else and passel them like a Tameh can do. V'chazar adin, and now we have a Tzad Hashava, meaning when you have two Malamdim, but each one has a pircha, has a certain hole to it, you join together, and each one proves that that hole is not really a hole, and it doesn't disqualify the kal v'chomer. So lo ra'izeh k'ra'izeh, lo ra'k'ra'izeh. Now I can combine these two categories, namely balmum and tameh. And atzad shavish behem shemuzharim v'im avru chilu, that a balmum is not, he's enjoined with a lav in the Torah not to do the avoda. A tummy is enjoined with a lav not to do the avoda. And in both cases, if they went ahead and they violated that isur and they did the avoda is mechuleles. Afani ovi zar. Now I could derive zar from this equation between the two of tummy and balmum, shu muzar, because a zar is not allowed to do the avoda. The Gemara is going to soon ask the question, how do we know that a zar is not allowed to do the avoda? Where's the lav in the Torah? V'im of archila. And therefore, just like in the cases of Balmum and Tameh, where he's enjoined from doing the avoda, if he went ahead and did the avoda is psula, so too in the case of a zar, he's enjoined from doing the avoda, and therefore the avoda is mechuleles. Minol and Muzar. The Gemara asks what's the source from which you derive that a zar is not allowed to do the avoda. Imi vi nozru. Now, we have a little bit of a problem because, as we'll soon see, the Gemara is going to point out that this is all going according to Rabbi Shmuel. And it happens to be that Rabbi Shmuel is going to derive conclusions about a zar from a kal vachomer. So if the Gemara will successfully interpret a pasuk as referring to a zar to teach us that he's enjoined from doing the avodah because he's not a kohen, then we don't know why Rabbi Shmuel would have to derive that conclusion from a kal vachomer. So we can't be too successful over here. Like, for example, the Gemara says, Imi vi nazru, if we're going to derive it from a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Chav Beis, which the Gemara had interpreted as referring to prohibiting a non-kohen from doing the avodah, then chil gufei ksivbei. Well, in that very same pasuk, we see that the pasuk says v'lo yechalalu. In that same pasuk that opens with the words the nazru. Maybe we'll read the whole pasuk. Here it says Daber Aaron Velbana vi nazru mikoche b'nei Yisrael. And the Gemara, which we saw yesterday, was expounding the extra words b'nei Yisrael to teach me that a non-kohen asher he makdishim li, and it says lo yechalu eshem kodshi. So there's chil. So if that pasuk is the source for a non-kohen, then we don't understand why Rabbi Shmuel would have derived the halacha of a zar's machal the avodah that he did based on a kal vachomer. Forget about a kal vachomer. He should derive from the pasuk. Elam, we must conclude that according to Rabbi Shmuel, zar lo yikrav aleichem, we have to derive the conclusion that a non-kohen zar is enjoined from doing the avodah from another pasuk. It can't be from the pasuk of Yinozu because that pasuk ends with the word lo yechalu, and then Rabbi Shmuel is not justified in deriving chil avodah in the case of a zar from a kal vachomer. So we're going to have to introduce the pasuk that says v'zar lo yikrav aleichem, which clearly indicates a lav and explicitly addresses the case of a zar. And this is a pasuk in Bamidbar Perek Yud Ches, and that prohibits a zar from performing the avodah. And the Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel is going to derive the isur of a non-kohen doing the avodah from this pasuk. And we only need the kal vachomer of Debei Rabbi Shmuel in order to derive the chil avodah. Now the Gemara goes back to the kal vachomer itself, or shall we say the tzad hashava, in which we combined balmum together with tameh. Equal mifrach. I have a pirch on that matzad. Malatzad hashava shebhem shein lo hutru b'bama. Oh, this is interesting. There were periods of Jewish history in which you were allowed to set up your own private altar, your own private mizbech. That was called a bama. For example, during the first 14 years when they entered into Eretz Yisrael, before they established the Mishkan, then there was a heter bamos. Later on, after the Churban of what's it called, of Mishkan Shiloh, there was also a period of time where there was a heter bamos. And the question is, who's allowed to be makriv on a bama? And the answer is that a Kohen who is not roy lahakriv for avoda in the Mishkan, in the Beis Hamikdash, is likewise excluded and disqualified from doing an avoda on a bama. For example, a tameh, or for example, a kohen who's a balmum. But In the case of a zar, interestingly enough, a zar could do the avoda on a bama, and the assumption is he's not a tameh, he's not a balmum. But we see clearly that the Torah was more machmir with regard to tameh and balmum, insofar as the Torah excluded them and disqualified them even from a bama, which is not the case in the case of a zar. So therefore, maybe that's why in the cases of a tameh who did the avoda or a balmum who did the avoda is mechuleles, but that chumrah only applies in those cases, but not to zar, where the Torah was more maker with regard to avoda b'bama. So Gemara says that I can reject that pircha. Why? Lo tema tame yochiach, ela ema onein yochiach. We're going to have to take out tame from this b'me'atzad and plug in and replace it with an onein. An onein who lost one of his 7 relatives, and he's a Kohen, is enjoined from doing the avoda, and if he does the avoda, it's possible, as we saw in our Mishnah here at the beginning of the second perek. And onein yochiach. Now, onein is okay. Now the question is, what's the status of an onein with regard to a bama? That's a gigantic controversy. Okay, he has a whole note here about a zar who's allowed to do the avoda on a bama. What about an onein? Again, the simple pshat in our sugya is that an onein is allowed to do the avoda on a bama. But the Gemara now has a pircha on onein because mal onein sheken osav maser. Maser, we're talking about maser sheni, which is brought to Yerushalayim and eaten b'kedusha in Yerushalayim, and it cannot be eaten by an onein. And that's why when they brought the Maser Sheni and they recited Vidui, in the Vidui they say, Lo achalti ba'onim, and I didn't eat the Maser Sheni when I was an onein. So you see the Torah is more machmir in an onein than in a zar. A zar is allowed to eat Maser Sheni. Balmum yochiach, but a balmum is allowed to eat Maser Sheni. And in that sense, he's just like a zar. And nevertheless, the balmum, if he does the avoda, his avoda is mechuleles. So therefore, you see that even though someone is allowed to eat maser sheni, like for example the Kohen balmum, nevertheless his avoda is mechuleles. So therefore, I could derive the conclusion about a zar, who even though he's allowed to eat maser sheni, nevertheless his avoda is mechuleles. And again, v'chazar adin. So now we have a substitute bal tzadashava lo roizeh keroizeh tzadashava shem shemuzharim. And again, we'll go back to the same tzadashava that both in the cases of Tomei and Balmum, right? Let's just quickly go over this. I'm trying to move at the speed of light because there's so much here to fit into an hour. So now we're learning a tzadashava from whatchamacallit, from Balmum and Onen. Balmum and Onen. Right, we got rid of Tomei because Tomei is Mitame Acherim. He's contagious. Now, if you're going to tell me, well, maybe we have to be machmir in the case of Balmum because he can't do the avoda in a bama, but we're going to prove it from an onen. And if you tell me we can't prove anything from an onen because an onen is enjoined from eating Maser Sheni, we're going to prove it from a tameh. No. One second, that doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry. There's so many different combinations here. It's hard to. Yeah, so we have to emphasize that a balmum is allowed to eat maser sheni, whereas an onen is not allowed to eat maser sheni. So onen alone, without balmum, would not be a source for this kal v'chomer because the Torah is more machmir and onen that enjoins him from eating maser sheni. But then we'll introduce balmum, and a balmum is not enjoined from eating maser sheni, and yet he's machal his avodah. And what are you going to prove? Wait a minute, I can't prove anything from Balmum because Balmum is excluded from doing avoda in the Boma, but then I'll introduce Onain. So that's the Tzad HaShavah. So the Gemara immediately objects. Hachinami lifroch, mala tzad HaShavah, shekain lo hutru b'Boma. I mean, now the Gemara seems to be assuming that an Onain cannot do the avoda in a Boma. Just one second. Okay, this is very disappointing to me here, but my Masifta is in Ramat Beit Shemesh. But there seems to be some, as I said before, a very controversial issue about a whether or not an onin can do the avoda in a bama. Just give me one more minute, just in case it pops up here. Because the Gemara said before that the chumrah of onin is that he's also b'maser sheni. The Gemara didn't say anything about bama. Right, and the chumrah of mum is that it applies to both the karev and the makriv, which has no application to one, but one has the chumrah that he can't eat maser sheni. So then we'll introduce balmum, who's allowed to eat maser sheni. So what's the pircha now? Haminami lifroch, and now we're going to have a pircha on balmum and onen shekei lo hutru b'bama. Again, the Gemara clearly is now saying that an onen is excluded from doing the avoda in a bama. Maskif la Rav Sama Brederov. Again, this is this very confusing point whether an onen is qualifies to do avoda in a bama or not. Man lemel unto onen osav bama dilmi shari bama. Now the Gemara is going back again to say that an onen can do the avoda in a bama. So it seems like at this point, the Gemara is accepting the tzad hashava from Baal Mum and Onen. Because if you'll say the chumrah of a Baal Mum is that it's both Karev and Makriv, Onen doesn't have that chumrah. And if you'll say the chumrah of an Onen is he can't eat from Maser Sheni, Baal Mum is allowed to eat from Maser Sheni. And if you try to add a pircha that, well, both of them, Baal Mum and Onen, cannot do the avoda in a bama, the answer is that we're holding now that an Onen can do the avoda in a bama. But the Gemara now is going to offer another possibility, another alternative. Rabbi Sharshi Omar, Asikav Chomer mi Yoshev. Now, this Gemara just boggles my mind. A Kohen who does the avoda in a sitting position is mechal the avoda. And yet, a Kohen could be sitting when he eats the basar. Is Asya Kavachor Yoshev. Ma Yoshev Sha'ochel. He's allowed to eat the basar while he's sitting. But im Avad Chil, if he goes and he does the avoda is mechuleles. And this is a Gemara later on at Daf Chav Gimel. Is Zar She'eno Ochel. Zar can't eat the basar of Kodesh Kodshim. Eno Dinshim Avad Chilel. So the Gemara says, Mali Yoshev, I'll tell you, there's a Chumra in Yoshev. What's the Chumra in Yoshev? Shkein Posel Yedus. The Torah says, V'yom du shnei anoshim. It means that when you give testimony, you have to stand. And a Yoshev is Posel Yedus. What does that have to do with Avodas HaMikdash? I can't understand it. I asked my friend Alan Dubin this morning after davening. He told me the first part is Zevachim and all the Yalfus are very complicated. So Gemara says, "Me Yoshev Talmud Chacham." I'll learn it from Talmud Chacham. The halacha is that a Talmud Chacham who comes into Bezdin, they allow him to give his testimony even in a sitting position. Gemara says, "Mal l'shem a Yoshev shekem posel yedus." Okay, you gave me one exception to the rule, and there is a case where a Yoshev is kosher yedus, but in general, a Yoshev is a psul edus, and therefore the category conceptually, right, in an abstract style of Yoshev is more chomer, in that it's excluded from testimony. So Gemara says, Ramasharshi Shem Yoresh Lo Shem Yoshev Lo Parech. He's not interested in the theoretical concept. He's interested in the case of Talmud Chacham. We have a case for Talmud Chacham where if he's sitting, he can give testimony, and if he does the avodah, he's machal his avodah, and therefore I could derive from Yoshev that a zar is likewise enjoined from doing the avodah, and likewise he's mechalas avodah. The imtim salom par asim Yoshev umichad mihanach. And if you want to say that maybe Rav Mishasha also accepts this principle of Shem Yoshev parich, that would be a valid pircha, then I'm going to add to Yoshev one of the other possibilities, which would be, because now we know that a non-Kohen I'm sorry. That a Kohen with a mum, right? A Kohen with a mum, right? He doesn't have that chumrah of being posel liedus. Even a Kohen who's a Baal Mum can testify, or an onen. Now again, I don't know if an onen is allowed to testify, but certainly his testimony is valid, and a tameh could be made in Bezdin. So that pircha that you say that there's a chumrah in Yoshev that he's posel yedus doesn't apply in any of the other categories. So we can take any of the other categories and add it to the tzad hashava. Frek the Gemara, the Yoshev de kosher bebama minala. Right, we're going to again reject Yoshev if we say that he is excluded from doing the avoda in the bama, because we said that a zar is allowed to do the avoda in bama. So it must be that Rav Misharshia, if he's deriving the conclusion about zar from Yoshev, it must be the old that Yoshev is kosher avoda in a bama. So how do we know that a Yoshev is kosher for avodah b'bama? Amar kra la'amod lifnei Hashem l'sharsam. When does the Torah say that the Kohen has to stand while he's doing the avodah? That's only lifnei Hashem. Lifnei Hashem means in the Beis Hamikdash. Lifnei Hashem v'lo lifnei bama. But in a private bama, that's not a Beis Hamikdash. That's not lifnei Hashem. And therefore, apparently the Torah is saying that a Yoshev is allowed to do the avodah in a bama. He doesn't have to stand, which would be very helpful if you had someone who who's on a wheelchair. He could do the avodah on a bama. Now the Gemara says, Onein, in our Mishnah, amongst the list of people who are kohanim that are machal their avodah, one of them is an Onein. Minon. From whence do we derive the conclusion that an onein passes the avodah? Dichsivu min hamikdash lo yetze v'lo yechalel. Regarding the Kohen Gadol, the Torah says that if he became an onein, he remains in the mikdash and he goes and continues to do these avodah, and he's not mechalel. And apparently, that's a special exception in the case of a Kohen Gadol. Ha'acher, a regular Kohen Hedjot, shelo yotz, if he became an onein and he didn't terminate his avoda, then he's machal his avoda. Now the Gemara quotes Rabbi Elazar, who has a different source from which he concludes that an onein is machal his avoda, and the Gemara later on is going to ask why isn't he satisfied with min hamikdash lo yetze? Amehach hein hikrivu ani ikravtu. Okay, now this really requires at least an hour to go through the psukim here in the whole parsha of the chatas of what's called the Soyer Chodesh of Rosh Chodesh at the time of the Hakomas HaMishkan. Anyway, there's a whole dialogue here between Moshe and Aaron because Aaron burnt the soil chatos. Mamish put it into a fire and burnt it. And Moshe was very critical. Aaron tried to defend himself. Now, during the course of the argument, Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to find some justification. Why did Aaron burn the soil Rosh Chodesh? And he suggested various possible, hadstakot, justifications. Now, one of the justifications that was suggested by Moshe Rabbeinu is that on that very day, Nadav Avihu, on the day of dedication of the Mishkan, had died. And therefore, Elazar and Itamar, the two brothers, sons of Aaron, remaining sons, were onanim. So therefore, maybe because they were an onan and they went ahead and they did the avodah, that's why the Soyer Rosh Chodesh was possible, and that's why they burnt it. So Aaron responds, and he says, Ani ekravti. I, as the Kohen Gadol, I was makriv the korban. And a Kohen Gadol, as an onain, which Aaron was on that day, is allowed to do the avodah because min hamikdash lo yetze. So therefore, Aaron was basically telling Moshe Rabbeinu that this is not the explanation as to why the soyer was burnt, because I was the one, meaning the Kohen Gadol was the one who did the avodah. Michlal, what do we derive from this by process of diuk? That the inu akriv shaper ishterov. That if what's his name, Elazar and Itamar, the two Odanim, would have done the avodah, then they'd have to burn the korban because it would be machal the avodah. So this would be a perfectly good source from which to conclude, as Rabbi Elazar does, that an onain is machal his avoda, with the exception of the Kohen Gadol. For Abelazar, my time below Omer in a Migdash, why was he not satisfied with the original drasha that we had, the derivation from Mina Migdash Lo Yetze, which means that that if the Kohen Gadol is an onain, then he doesn't leave the Beis Hamikdash. He continues with the Azavod, implying that if he was a regular Kohen and he was an onain, then he would have to desist from his Avod. Right? The Torah doesn't say explicitly that, that if he was a regular Kohen, then he would be Mechalel. The Torah wanted to be Mechadesh. That in the case of Kohen Gadol, he dafka would have been Mechal Hasavod. Again, the Havamina of the Torah, so to speak, according to Rabbi Lazar, is that no other Kohen other than Kohen Gadol would be Mechal his Avodah if he was an Onen. Dafka, in the case of a Kohen Gadol, he would be Mechal the Avodah when he's an Onen. Just the opposite of what the conclusion is. And why would we think that a Kohen Gadol would be Mechal his Avodah? Because he's on such a high level and he has such a great Kedusha that his Aninus would be a disqualification of his Avod, Kamash Balon, and that's why the Torah wants to tell you that even the Kohen Gadol is not Mechal his Avodah as an Onein, and all other Kohenim are not Mechal his Avod. So this pasuk would not be a source. Gemara says, "V'idach my time alo Omar mehein yakrivu," right? So, all the other possibilities of deriving Onein, which we said we could from Hain Hikrivu. I'm sorry. Why did the other Shita, we'll call it right now, of course, because we don't have time, why didn't they derive it from Aaron's answer to Moshe Rabbeinu of Hain Hikrivu? Because Savram Tuma Nisrafim. Oh boy, this we really fell into a big sugi here. There are two ways of understanding why they burnt the Sayer of Rosh Chodesh at the time of the Hakomas HaMishkan. Until now, we've been assuming because the Onein did the Avodah. And now the Gemara is assuming no. It's because it happened to be that the Basar of the Sayer contracted Tumah. And therefore, when you have a carbon that's Tameh, you have to burn it. Okay, this is all a sugya on Daf Kuf Aleph, back and forth as to why the Chatos was actually burnt. Was it because of Aninus, or was it because of Tumas HaBasar? So it happens to be that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon over there at the end of Maseches Zevachim hold that Chatos on the day of Hakomas HaMishkan was burned because it contracted tumah during the course of the day. And then the Gemara has a whole discussion there about what Aaron said back to Moshe in that case. And when Aaron remarked, Hein Hayom Hikrivu, he was saying, behold, I'm reading the English translation, it is yet that on this day that they offered their chatos. And why were we justified in burning the chatos? Because since they were owning him the entire day, they would defer the eating until after their aninus would terminate at nightfall. And then at that point, they were planning to eat the meat, except for the fact that inadvertently the meat became tummy. So that even upon nightfall, although they were no longer owning him, they were enjoined from eating the meat because the meat became tummy, and that's why they burnt it. If that be the case, then Aaron's comment back to Moshe Rabbeinu had nothing to do with the performance of an avoda on the part of an onen. Debei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, Asir b'kavachomri Baal Mu. So now we have another possible source to derive that an onen is precluded from avoda. And we're going to derive it according to Debei Rabbi Shmuel from a kavachom from Baal Mu.